Podcast 001.
It's exciting.
So a good place to start is to quickly intro ourselves, because what we do for a living is make brands.
Sure.
So every time we do a project comes with a bit of insight, and we thought we'd share some of that insight as we roll along. And I think the first place to start is to talk about what is a brand. And it seems like a simple question, oftentimes with a simple answer.
Yeah.
But quite often it's the case that we have a narrow view of what brand is.
Sure.
So question is, what is a brand?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we start with maybe what that narrow view might be, what do most people think about when they hear the word brand? And I think if we talk about clients that come and meet with us too, it's also like just something they think they need to get done. I need to get my brand sorted or fixed or done, like it's this fixed thing, or set of deliverables. But, I think the obvious answer is it's like your logo. That's what everyone thinks of when they think of their brand. But I think that perception is obviously quite small, and we know from experience, and we'll talk about it today, that there's obviously a lot more that goes into what your brand is, but also the end result. What is it actually doing for your business? But also, it's a living, breathing thing, I guess, as we see it. So we'll touch on that. I think the perception is definitely changing. People are starting to understand that it's more than a logo. But I guess we're here to chat about even more depth to what that is and all the layers that go into a brand.
Yeah, I mean, why do people think that it's just a logo? Like, how's that perception arisen?
Yeah, I think it's like brand is a funny term. It's a little bit like design too. Like, people think of design as just something as how it looks, but really, like, design is any decisions that you make into how something functions as well, and works and exists and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's the same with brand. It just gets distilled down into the most obvious and historical thing of what people think of. The logo is the first thing you see, obviously, and it's, in a way, it is kind of the vessel for everything else that we'll talk about. I'm sure that logos were invented in the first place to do that job, to be the insignia of a business, so it's obvious, I guess, when you think about it like that, as to why that's what people think of as a brand. And I think the other thing too is the broader concept's just a bit harder to wrap your head around or think about, or people think of brand and branding as the designer's job or the agency's job, whereas all the other things, I guess, that we would see that go into a brand are, I guess, usually handled or seem to be handled by a different department. HR deals with culture, so that's a HR issue. It's not a branding issue, that sort of thing.
So when you personally think brand, like, what are the things that, how do you break it down? How do you analyze it? How do you look at it?
I think that's where it's like, we can talk about, and we will, I guess, that it's more than your logo. It's the rest of your visual identity and what you say and all those sorts of things. But I think the actual word itself, brand, is really more about what do people think and feel about your business.
Yeah, I agree.
Those other things are really just tools to influence that outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I think brand, first and foremost, is a feeling more than anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, if you think about any of the brands that you love or that I love, I think it's a feeling more than anything.
It's like an undercurrent that exists,
Yeah.
And that's where it does tie back to the logo, because it becomes what feelings and associations do you have when you see that logo.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
It's the actual feelings and thoughts and perceptions and wants that you have, or desires for that brand. That is the brand, to me.
Because so much of brand we think about as being identity, as being that sort of the front facing the show, so to speak.
Yeah, the good looks.
But to get that feeling across, there's a lot of nuanced territory to go through, and that's, I guess, some of the things that we'll try and unpack.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing too. I mean, I sort of see it in a way sometimes as like everyone's individual perception of your brand is like a bucket. And every experience that you have with that brand is then tipping something more into that bucket,
Yes.
So it's not even something that just happens once and then that's your perception of the brand forever. It's actually something that builds and evolves over time. Pretty much every time you have some sort of interaction, whether you see an ad or walk into a store or buy a product or, you know, even experience that product or service over time, meet the people behind the brand, that's all adding to your perception and feeling. It's going to, you know, go up and down depending on whether you're having positive or negative experiences.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, if brand is a feeling, and I think the other aspect of a brand is its role in attracting attention, because and that's definitely the role that identity plays in brand. But brand is about trust as well.
Absolutely, that's a key feeling that you want to create. I mean, that's the thing. Again, that's where, like, if you just focus purely on the visuals, you know, you're not going to get all the way to where you want to go, because there's all these different feelings that you want to create, and it's all those elements and experiences combined that create those feelings, you know, whether it's trust, confidence, desire, passion, you know, there's a whole range of things depending on your brand as well that you're really trying to prioritize and create within that brand perception and feeling. So, you know,
and so when we talk about the layers that actually influence a brand, and these are all the sort of the unseen things, the things that are required to build the baseline behind a brand. And often we've talked obviously about how brand is often associated with identity and identity only. But when I think about brand, I also think about it being the earliest kernel of a brand is actually the mission. So oftentimes when a founder's involved, they're trying to make a change. They're trying to put their values into a brand, and that's almost like the very baseline and where it starts. But then that shifts to positioning as well too. Sure. And you may or may not have heard of positioning, but positioning is something that, you know, we play in that space a lot. And I mean, just to explain positioning, I mean, what is positioning, and like why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, like what you said there about it being about mission and values and what's driving the business or idea or whatever, the brand in the first place. Is that, okay, well, we need to take all of that and then turn it into a brand, you know, or the brand layers that will ultimately influence those perceptions that we talked about. And so positioning really is just that first step of actually clarifying all those things. You know, who is this business? What are they offering? Who's it for? What makes it unique? Like, you can't do all this other stuff until you have that, you know, really clear, because that's what makes all those other elements that are to come, you know, that much more powerful and consistent. But a huge part of it really is, you know, authenticity, and also those things being created to drive that original mission, you know, or to fulfill it, or to put it out there in the world, you know, in a really clear way. It's why positioning and clarity is so important. You need to know what you're trying to say and how you're trying to say it before you even start opening your mouth.
Yeah, and positioning is like super strategic as well too, because it's a way of being able to position yourself away from your competitors. And oftentimes when you look at the biggest brands, it's by design. You wouldn't realize that, but all of that can be kind of attributed back to positioning.
100%.
Okay, so then if positioning is one of those cornerstones, one of the pillars to brands, if we're to shift away from that, one of the other layers that is contained within a brand is this tone of voice or the personality, and that usually manifests in messaging and copywriting. But what aspects of tone of voice and messaging are important for brand? Why is that even a factor?
Yeah, I mean, I think two of the biggest things that definitely come to mind with messaging is that so many people that we talk to, like, they have a really good idea, or they know themselves what they're trying to say, but then they just don't know how to say it. So messaging is so much about clarifying and communicating that brand story, you know, like they can tell you all about it, you know, face to face or over a half an hour conversation, but distilling that down into some brand messages that you can take to the world and you know, have someone immediately understand what you're trying to say is not easy. But also then I think it's a huge place to show that authenticity again and personality, as you mentioned, of the brand. You know, like the written word is where, you know, the people behind the brand often really come out, and what they're trying to say obviously is distilled. And, you know, we often talk about it, the positioning part, and it bleeds a lot into the messaging, is almost being like holding a mirror up to the people behind the brand and the brand itself, you know. So it's actually how do we best reflect their personality and their passion, you know, because it's got to be authentic, you know, to ultimately last.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about that just in our studio. It's like there's no point being a company projecting a personality that you can't own authentically.
Exactly.
Because you can never back that up.
Yeah.
Like you might be able to put that up as your veneer, as your brand identity, but when people actually meet you in the flesh, or they come in and experience your store and your services, and it fails to meet that expectation of the brand personality, there's a real disconnect there.
Yeah,
and that's why the personality piece really is very important in all of this.
I mean, that's a great example too of why it's so important for all these layers to line up, you know, because exactly like you talked about there, is like, if your personality on your website's completely different to your in-person personality, like people just will instantly switch off and think it's all fake, you know.
Yeah.
Like, so it's about being real, and, you know, that will come through. Like, if you think about most of the brands that you most affiliate with or feel an affinity towards, it's because their personality is similar to yours, or, you know, it's a personality that you want to associate with.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I was going to throw in there too. I mean, we are living in hyper competitive times where it's really easy to spin up a company and to be in the market. And I think brand is becoming even more important in modern times because it is so easy for you to start up a business. And oftentimes you find there's only a degree of separation. Like, personality alone can be the factor.
Differentiator.
For a huge differentiator. Let's even just assume that brand identity is exactly the same. So like one firm looks exactly the same as another, but you're saying different things with a different tone and different inflection.
Yeah.
That can be the difference between winning and not.
Yeah. And I think as well, the last thing for me on positioning and messaging together is that often, or I'd say almost always, forms this foundation that we see for brands that just then lasts for years and years. You know, it's important to distinguish between messaging and even just basic copywriting, or even like more campaign-driven ideas where it's like, this is what we're going to say, you know, on a poster for a month, you know, as a marketing campaign. Like messaging we see as really foundational. It's the core things that you want to say and communicate. And, you know, if you're doing, you know, things will evolve, of course, but if you're doing them, you know, if you're starting with that mission and clear purpose, like often what you want to say about that is going to last. I mean, we have clients who we did messaging for them 5 years ago, and they're still using that same content on social media posts today because it's so much about the core fundamentals of their brand. You know, it's still relevant.
Yeah, it's a great point. And because really you've got this core framework which houses all those you know, do not break, you know, messages.
Yeah.
And then you've also got this tactical element that can kind of bounce a little bit.
Yeah.
Like it can shift, but as long as you're always referencing this core messaging framework and personality, then you're always going to stay on brand. You're always going to be true to brand.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I mean, we've had pillars of positioning, of tone and voice and messaging. Once you've got those pillars in place, that allows us to shift into brand identity, usually in our process.
Yep.
So what's involved in brand identity? Like what makes a great identity to start with?
Yeah, I mean, this is the obvious thing that people think of when they think of a brand. You know, the logo itself. I mean, we always try and shift that conversation very quickly from a logo to a visual identity. And, you know, if we think of your positioning and as your personality and what you say, then, you know, the visual identity is the good looks part of it. And in a lot of ways, I guess, you know, the logo itself is kind of meant to be that one single, you know, version of your identity. But you know, if you think about it, especially in these days with the internet and everything, you never just see the logo, right? Like, well, very rarely. So
Yeah.
it's that whole plethora of visual tools, I guess, that you have, or, you know, look and feel. You know, so it goes across photography, like, is a huge part of your visual identity. You know, what photography style do you use? How do you showcase your people and environment to the world, you know, in a visual way? You know, and that's, again, where that links back to personality. You know, your photography style should reference your brand personality.
Yeah.
There's other things like, you know, patterns and graphical elements and, you know, colors and style. You know, a lot of that goes into creating that bigger visual identity. And then a huge part of it, again, comes back to consistency. You know, if you're going to look a certain way on your website, you should look that same way in your printed materials. Ideally, you should look that way, you know, even in your physical environment. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm still, I mean, even though we've been in this game for almost a decade now, I'm still almost always blown away by just that simple change of typeface can change the way that you feel about a brand. Like sans serif versus sans.
Yeah.
Like it blows me away that you can make that small little change, and that can make you feel differently about a brand.
The shape of an M, you know, from one font to the next is totally different.
Colours. I mean, colours.
For sure.
Colours are a huge factor.
Yeah.
Okay, so identity, I mean, once you've built up all of these, I mean, we're starting to build layers into a brand, and it's obviously always referencing these foundational parts of a brand. But once you've got to the point of brand identity, then that allows you to create, I guess, assets.
Yeah.
And when we talk about assets, we're talking about things like whether it's a digital platform, whether it's a website, whether it's social, print, environmental, branding. But once you've got that, it allows you then to then start to think about how you play out the communication pieces.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's the thing. Once you've got that foundation of those things you just touched on, then it's kind of executing that and taking that out to the world, you know.
Yeah.
Those things become the common hymn sheet that everyone's, you know, singing from, or should be.
Yeah.
You know, those things you sort of, I guess, you know, become the bedrock of everything else.
Yeah, why is that important though? Like, that you do all of those things to then arrive at this point where, like, so let's take an example of building a website. Like, why is it important to input a high level of brand within those touch points?
Yeah, I mean, web to me is such a great sort of example of where brand, you know, culminates and comes to life. You know, web, obvious, you know, it's sort of blatantly obvious in this day and age, but, you know, it's going to be often the first impression that someone has of your brand. You know, they're going to chuck your name into Google because they heard about you from someone at a networking event. Yep. And what's, you know, the first thing that's going to pop up is your website. So if brand is all about perception and creating good feelings and thoughts and wants and desires, then, you know, you want that first impression to be a good one. So, you know, straight away it's got to imbue all that visual identity that you've created in terms of design of the website. But then very quickly beyond that, you know, it becomes about the messaging and the story that you're trying to tell. It also would, you know, is the place to define your offering and how it's different, how you do it. You know, some cases it's even the place where people are making that purchase decision, you know, and handing over their credit card details. So web is obviously crucial. It can be the total difference between whether you even find out that they found out about you, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think the other thing I think about when it comes to creating the assets is that like, for example, with a website, that could be the first interaction that you're having with a customer. So that could be a first time interaction, or somebody could see your bus shelter poster, or, you know, they might see some sort of piece of printed collateral. That's the first interaction. So it's that attention and trust is so imperative at that point. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, as you say, attention is fickle, and even more so every day, you know, these days. So that first impact, you know, you've got to make it a good one.
Yeah.
And that's where we often see that visual and that very first headline message, you know, because messaging, before we didn't really touch on this, but is a lot about hierarchy as well, you know, sort of organizing the 100 things that you could say into key themes, and then within those themes creating some sort of hierarchy of what are the most important things that I could say.
Yeah.
And often a website homepage is the culmination of that. Combine those most important messages with your visual style, and that's what creates that, you know, attention grabbing or engagement to stick around and learn more.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. That's a big pickup, actually, because I often think about some of the best brands globally and also locally is simplicity is at the heart of these, but simplicity is actually really difficult to achieve.
It's the hardest thing.
It's the hardest thing, right?
I mean, I think about most of what we do is actually creating clarity for our clients, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, messaging's a great idea. They've got 100 things that they want to say, and, you know, when they first think about it, they see them all as completely even. Or, you know, like, how do I distill that down into, you know, 2 or 3 lines of copy? And that's where we come in, I guess, in all the cases.
Cool. Okay, so I mean, we've sort of unpacked a few of the layers here, and we're going to dive into some of those layers in future podcasts as well too, where we'll go a little bit deeper on brand identity. We'll go a little bit deeper on positioning and kind of really get into the nuts and bolts of it. Go down that rabbit hole.
I mean, there's so much more that we can touch on too. You know, we see brand as, you know, who do you hire? Like, what do your people like? You know, how do you train them? What do you do to retain them? You know, what's your company culture? Like, that's a huge part of brand. Obviously, how you interact with your customers, and again, not just online, but, you know, in person, over the phone, whatever. You know, all those touch points and experiences are going into that bucket, you know, to build that overall impression over time. You know, what does your location and your environment look like? I know this is one that you're big time on.
Yeah.
You know, it's usually just not even considered at all, I'd say, you know, in terms of, especially for like a lot of service businesses or whatever, where it's just, our office looks like our office. You know, retail's a bit different. They obviously, you know, have a bit more of a brand presence, but, you know, it's so important.
Yeah, I mean, physical location is a big one, and it's overlooked now because, I mean, I think there's a few factors here when it comes to environmental branding, and that, you know, a lot of us are working out of co-working spaces now, or, you know, we're working out of office locations where the client doesn't necessarily come and visit all that often. So we think about those spaces and think that they're a little bit redundant, but that's not really the case, because your employees and your team are working within these environments, and branding has a huge impact on them.
For sure.
And you know, I think we often think about brand as being something that's external, it's for bringing in customers, but it's actually a great retention and hiring strategy as well, as to go deeper on brand. And
then it's only then going to be projected back outwards too, because all those staff and how they feel about the brand, they're going to put that out in the world.
Yeah.
And that's going to create more perception about brand. But I mean, even to touch on something you just said there around like the type of office you even choose, you know, as part of your brand. Like you mentioned co-working there, and it's like we even have clients who, I would say, whether it's totally conscious or somewhat subconsciously, have chosen their work environment to feel more modern and different, you know, than other people in their industry. So even just deciding, okay, where's our office going to be, you know, is a part of defining your brand, you know, that people wouldn't think of.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this just really kind of goes to this larger point. The brand has so many tentacles that reach into so many different parts of your business, and when you consider everything as a whole to make up a brand, there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy task either. Like, especially if you're a startup brand, or even if you're an established brand as well too. I think it's a challenge, and you've got to take each piece and start to bite and chew on each piece to try and figure out how to make it better, how to strengthen it. Yeah.
Well, that is the very first step, is that you've got to consider these things, right?
Right. Yeah.
You've actually got to start thinking about them as a choice about your brand, and what's the effect that that's going to have on your customers and how they feel about you over time, you know, and not just think about them in terms of either financials or other practicalities, you know.
Yeah.
It's going to happen whether you think about it or not, you know. Where you choose your office is going to affect how people feel about your brand, whether you consciously made that decision or not.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, well, we should wrap up podcast 001.
Yeah.